Computer security is a topic that affects us all, whether we realize it or not. From online shopping to online banking, we rely on our computers and the internet to keep our personal information safe. However, in recent years, there has been a growing concern about the vulnerabilities in computer systems that could put that information at risk. Spectre and Meltdown are two of the most important vulnerabilities that have been discovered in recent years. These vulnerabilities could potentially be used by hackers to steal sensitive information, including passwords, credit card numbers, and other confidential data. That's why it's so important that we need to understand what Spectre and Meltdown are and how we can protect ourselves from them. In 2017, researchers were conducting a study on the security feature called kernel page table isolation, which was designed to protect computers against a different type of attack, known as the side channel attack. KPTI works by isolating the kernel memory, which is where the most sensitive parts of the data of the operating systems are stored, from user programs. During that study, the researchers found that the KPTI had a greater impact on Intel processors than on other processors. This piqued their curiosity and led them to investigate further. They soon discovered that the modern Intel CPUs had a fundamental design flaw that could be exploited to read arbitrary memory data from any location, including the kernel memory, with the help of side channels and cache timing. The researchers from Graz University of Technology in Austria were the first to publicly report the Spectre and Meltdown vulnerabilities. They found that the design flaw was present in almost all modern CPUs, including those from Intel, AMD, and ARM. This meant that billions of devices around the world were potentially vulnerable. The researchers notified affected companies and worked with them to develop patches and fixes for their vulnerabilities. However, the patches also had a performance impact, as they had to change the way CPUs process data to prevent the vulnerabilities from being exploited. This led to a lot of debate and discussion about the trade-offs between security and performance in computer systems. CPUs are the brains of most modern computers. They're responsible for processing data, running applications, and executing commands. In recent years, researchers discovered two major security vulnerabilities that affect most CPUs. These vulnerabilities are known as Spectre and Meltdown. So what are they, and how do they work? Spectre and Meltdown are both caused by a design flaw that the way CPU processes data. Normally, when a program runs on a CPU, it can only access its own memory. This memory is protected by the CPU, so other programs can't access it. However, with Spectre and Meltdown, a hacker can exploit a technique called speculative execution to access data that is supposed to be protected. Speculative execution is a technique used by most modern CPUs during the pipelining process. This is designed to process the instructions more quickly during the pipelining process. Pipelining involves breaking down an instruction into smaller steps and then process each step in parallel. This allows the CPU to execute instructions much more quickly than it has to process each instructions one at a time. However, pipelining can lead to a problem called instruction dependencies. In some cases, an instruction may depend on the result of previous instruction, and if the previous instruction has not completed yet, then the CPU will have to wait before it can process the next instruction. To overcome this problem, CPU use a technique called instruction speculation. With instruction speculation, the CPU will make a guess about the outcome of an instruction that has not been completed yet. It will then start processing the next instruction based on that guess. If the guess turns out to be correct, then the CPU saves time by not having to wait for the previous instruction to complete. If the guess is incorrect, then the CPU will discard the work it has done and start all over. This technique works well in most cases, but it can create vulnerabilities when it comes to security. In the case of Spectre and Meltdown, attackers were able to exploit the way that the CPU speculate about the outcome of instructions to gain access to sensitive data.
Okay, I'm Xiaoyu. I'm going to talk about the Spectre attack techniques. Two techniques that Spectre attacks primarily use are bounce check bypass and branch attack injection. Bounce check bypass uses the fact that modern CPU use hardware-based bounce checking to ensure that a memory access stay within the bounds of an array or buffer. Spectre attacks can bypass this protection by letting the CPU to run code that access memory outside the bounds of an array, effectively leaking sensitive information to the attackers. For the meltdown attack techniques, the techniques used in meltdown attacks involve using a CPU feature called out-of-order execution. When instructions are executed out of order, CPUs may execute memory access instructions before verifying if they're permitted. Meltdown attacks trick CPUs into executing memory access instructions that are usually prohibited, such as reading from kernel memory. Attackers can then recover the contents of kernel memory through side-channel attack techniques, potentially exposing confidential data like passwords and encryption keys.
Hello, my name is Ashton Bloom, and I will be talking about mitigation techniques for the Spectre and Meltdown. There's essentially two main ways that these issues are attempted to be patched or, fixed. Those are within microcode updates and operating system patches. These microcode updates are usually within the actual hardware of the CPU itself, whereas the operating system is obviously within the operating system. Now, how these patches and fixes actually work depend completely on the architecture of the CPU or the manufacturer or even the operating system. We'll start with AMD because they're a little more interesting than all the other ones. So starting with AMD, they were originally thought to be immune to meltdown attacks, but it was recently demonstrated that one variant actually does work on AMD CPUs, that variant being balance check bypass. This was the case that they only had this one variant or thought were to be immune initially was because AMD handled memory encryption a little differently from Intel and other CPU manufacturers. The other main technique that AMD and even Intel CPUs implement, or ARM as well, is called kernel page table isolation, KPTI for short. And essentially what it does is prevents the user from accessing kernel memory. But I'll leave that to be discussed more in the later section. A few more mitigation techniques that AMD CPUs implement against Spectre specifically are indirect branch prediction barrier, indirect branch restricted speculation, ret pooling, single thread indirect branch predictors, and speculative store bypass disable. Intel and ARM CPUs implement these same kind of mitigation techniques, although they generally all kind of have slightly different names from them, even though they all mean essentially the same thing. And I'll leave it to my group and even the paper itself to explain what these actually are a little more. But something I'd like to touch on is a lot of the times with cybersecurity issues such as this is something that doesn't get touched on is actually training the users of the systems on how to be safe, and obviously good system practices such as isolation, sandboxing, and even privilege separation. But that kind of mitigation technique can be often overlooked in these situations as well. Thank you.
In conclusion, Spectre and meltdown attacks poses a significant threat to our computer systems. While current mitigation techniques can only offer limited protection due to designs of our modern CPUs, we can continue to explore new methods to make it more difficult for these attacks to occur. However, to fully solve these issues, we should need to redesign our CPU's architecture from the ground up, which is a daunting task. In the meanwhile, we must prioritize proper security measures and training weak links in the cybersecurity chain to reduce the occurrence of these attacks until a permanent solution is found.